Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 29th and tonight's movie is The Dark and the Wicked. This is a horror movie directed by Brian Bertino, the same man who directed The Strangers, which was one of the movies from the very first Horror Nights. I remember The Strangers being decent enough. It's not the best slasher out there, but that movie did enough right and had enough going for it to sort of have its own identity. The Strangers was his first movie, and he directed two other movies between that and this one. I decided to go with this one because it seemed the most promising to me. Much like Relic, I wouldn't be surprised if this movie was at least partially inspired by Hereditary, because I got a pretty similar vibe from the trailer. Apparently, it's just these brother and sister whose mom died, and she apparently discovered something she shouldn't have beforehand. I'm a sucker for a good haunted house movie, and this movie looks like it's gonna try really hard to be scary. I'm gonna go watch it. I'm giving The Dark and the Wicked an 8 out of 10. The horror is great. It might be the scariest movie of the entire month, but there isn't that much else there. And even though the horror is, for the most part, executed very well, it's not particularly unique. But as I've said when I was talking about Malignant, a movie doesn't have to be completely, totally different from everything else in order to still be good. One problem that I did have with The Strangers that still persists in this movie is that it is too dark. It's not so bad that you can't see what's going on, but it just seems pointless to me. You kind of get some contrast because you see the main house of the movie where there's barely any light at all, and then you actually see a house that has normal lighting. But it's not like the main house of the movie, the farmhouse, doesn't have power. It's not like there aren't lights in there. Another issue is the fact that the dialogue is very difficult to understand. The characters in the movie do have southern accents, but they just don't speak clearly. They mumble so much. There are some lines in this movie I can't even try to guess what they were. But I think it is worth getting through the weird darkness and the mumbly lines when you get to some of the horror scenes in this movie. Not all of them are great. Some of them don't work out that well. There was one example where they had the jump scare in the score with the sting, and it seemed to almost happen before the thing appeared, so I got jump scared by that, and I didn't even know what I was supposed to be looking at. Also, this movie does that thing where they try to jump scare you with the title. But other than a couple examples, a lot of the horror in this movie is very effective. And there's a good amount of variety here. Some of the scares are really subtle, some of them are about as subtle as a knitting needle right in the eye. And fitting enough, I think that the scariest moment was the very last one. This movie is nothing groundbreaking, but it is executed very well when it comes to horror. And I mean, if you want to get scared this Halloween, this would be the best movie for that out of all the ones I've seen this month so far. So yeah, overall I would say flawed, but ultimately pretty good. And now I want to talk about a few spoilers. The main plot of this movie is that there's this brother and sister named Louise and Michael, and they are at their childhood home, or at least the home that their parents live in, and their dad is almost dead. He's kind of like in a catatonic state. Their mother used to be the one taking care of him, but one night, out of the blue, she cuts her fingers into little pieces and hangs herself in the barn. In the following days, they read her journal and start to suspect that there's something deeply evil in this house. They never tell you anything specific about what this thing is. It could be a demon, it could be the devil, I don't know. But one interesting thing is that almost for the entire movie, it doesn't kill any of the characters, it makes them kill themselves. One of the best scenes was a dream sequence that Louise had. She was sleeping in the bed next to her dad, and she had a dream where this shadowy figure started like crawling onto the bed and over her dad, and she never turns around to look, and we never see it clearly, but you hear these weird, creepy noises that get louder and louder and louder. Eventually, she turns to look, her dad's not on the bed, but he is on the ceiling. That scene didn't have a jump scare, but a lot of the other ones did, and they weren't super cheap. Some of them were actually kind of clever. For example, the last night that Michael is at the house, he's at the barn taking care of the goats. Like, they have like dozens of goats, and almost all of them got massacred earlier that day. But he's at the barn, and then he sees the naked form of his dead mother walking up to him, and she gets closer and closer and closer until she's right up in his face, and he like closes his eyes and looks away, and when he opens them and turns back, she's gone. His back was pressed against the wall, so he takes a few steps forward, and it's very surprising to him and the audience when her ghost pops up behind him. But as previously stated, my favorite scare in the film is the very last one. By the end of the movie, everybody is dead except for Louise, and she is by her father's side. And he slowly is like, his breathing gets more and more infrequent, and eventually he dies. And all the while, she's hearing and seeing something approach. One thing I really liked about this scene is that it then cut to an overhead shot, and you can see the dead dad's eyes slowly open. There's no jump scare, there's no attention drawn to it. And then it cuts to a side perspective, and it shows the dad, like, lurch upright and attack her. And then the movie just stops. One thing that this movie has in common with The Strangers is that it's very bare bones and simplistic in story. The Strangers was a no-frills version of a slasher. This is a no-frills version of a haunted house movie. Both of them are pretty thin in regards to both plot and character, but they try to make up for that by putting it all into the horror. And that could be good or bad depending on how you look at it. I thought that it was good, even though I could barely understand what they were saying most of the time. And with that, I'll see you tomorrow.